welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. I would like to thank everyone who supports us on Patreon. Your contributions help to make the show sustainable. When you're ready to launch your next project, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so you should check out Linode at www.podcastinit.com/Linode and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for running your app or experimenting with something that you hear about on the show. You can visit the site at www.podcastinit.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the newsletter, read the show notes, and get in touch. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes or Google Play Music, tell your friends and coworkers, and share it on social media. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Tim Abbott about Zulip, a powerful open source group chat. So, Tim, could you please introduce yourself?
I'm currently the lead developer of Zulip, which is leading open source group chat software. We're actually by sort of contributor volume, both in terms of total number of people and just how much activity is going in the leading open source group chat platform today. And I sort of work on basically every aspect of the project, from the web app to the mobile apps to the integrations, to the sort of core tooling and so on. A little bit of sort of background, I've previously sort of spent a lot of time doing startups. So I was the CTO of Ksplice, which was technology for updating and running Linux kernel without rebooting. We sort of got the technology working basically flawlessly for turning like a Linux source code patch as sort of the input into our bootless kernel update for that source code patch in a sort of completely automated fashion, and ended up running a subscription service with like hundreds of thousands of servers being updated with it. So that's sort of one piece of my background. The other sort of piece of it is sort of Zulip's own backstory. So I'll get into that when we talk more about Zulip, I guess.
And how did you first get introduced to Python?
Sure. Yeah. So it's there's sort of two versions of that story. So I think my first experience with Python was actually in high school. I was taking an AI class, which I guess the sort of that class has historically been a class where one used scheme and did algorithms like A star and that kind of genetic algorithms and neural networks and that kind of stuff. But we had this new teacher who was really and I was really into board games. And so he decided that what people are going to do for their sort of final projects is write AIs for the game of Risk. And he really, sort of, that sounds like maybe a great concept for a project. And in fact, it was, but he had no intention of actually building a grader to actually have them play against each other. He was just going to, just going to have people write it and grade them based on how interesting their algorithm was or something. So, a friend of mine, ended up deciding to write a grader for this. And he wrote this sort of framework in Python, which, you could sort of watch it play and there'd be sort of an API where your program could play Risk. So that was sort of my first experience sort of interacting with Python. And it was just pretty cool, like how he was sort of able to throw together this whole system, pretty quickly with the Python graphics libraries and so on. But I sort of really first got into Python actually when I was working on Ksplice. So, I sort of had a lot of experience with Perl before that. But I just always found it like kind of frustrating to do something complicated with Perl, because you either end up writing a ton of code yourself or having to grab all these, sort through tons of sort of low quality modules on CPAN. And, it ended up just being a really great experience, for Ksplice. We built all of our sort of automation infrastructure, the sort of desktop client you could run on your, Ubuntu machine that sort of worked like Update Manager, where it'd tell you, if you got some new rootless updates installed, and you just click a button and it installs them, and it'll show you like, here's the CD numbers that you just fixed and that kind of stuff. And the web application, we just found it like a sort of really nice platform that you could use to sort of build, an entire, set of applications, anything from sort of like our sort of automation to our, sort of the whole thing, and just have sort of one language that you needed to know in order to do any of the sort of work at our company.
And I'm sure that led nicely into your work with Zulip. So I'm wondering if you can dig a bit into what Zulip is and what was the initial inspiration for creating it.
Yeah, so the Zulip is probably one of the more fascinating histories for sort of open source projects out there. So I guess like what is Zulip? So Zulip is sort of several things. It's a full featured modern group chat application. And by full featured I mean it sort of has everything. There's a server. There's a sort of web application, which is sort of the way that most people might start out using it. There's desktop apps implemented in Electron. We have mobile apps, which we have recently switched to be on React Native, which has been a great experience so far. There's integrations with, every version control system, every, popular, issue tracker, like, dozens and dozens of sort of native integrations, hundreds more that you can do through things like IFTTT, if this and that, or Zapier. It's got, an API, there's documentation, there's sort of all these different sort of pieces. Second, like Zulip is completely open source. So, many of the other sort of open source group chat things that you'll see around, they're actually sort of open core and really like don't satisfy the Debian free software guidelines or whatever. Zulip is really about being 100% open source. We care a lot about having a vibrant open source community with people from a wide range of backgrounds. And we've been very successful in building that. There's over 300 people have contributed code to the Zulip server. Hundreds of commits go into Zulip every day. Our sort of usual release, when you do a big release every few months, has like 150 distinct people who have contributed code. It's a pretty wide open source project. Sort of finally, it's really optimized for productivity. So Zulip has a significantly different model from a lot of, sort of other open source or not group chat tools like Slack or IRC or whatever. So all of those have sort of the model where you have, a channel and it's just a time sorted sequence of messages and there's sort of no organization in there. And this could be, pretty problematic if you just want to be talking about multiple things with the same audience at the same time. Because fundamentally, like if there's a conversation already happening, you sort of have to decide like, if you want to bring up something just totally unrelated, like do you wait until that conversation finishes, or do you just sort of mention your thing and hope somebody replies to it, or it may actually just cause that other conversation. It's just really hard to talk about multiple things at the same time with the same group of people. And this has been a frustration of mine, in IRC, going back, for a very long time. And the same issue is true and is present in Slack. It's just sort of fundamental to the model. So the way that sort of Zulip does things is sort of the same solution that email uses for this problem. So you have basically a subject line, on a message, and usually it's just a word or two because you don't need a lot of context in chat. When you send a message to Zulip, like 97% of the time you're just replying and you don't need to think about this, but if you want to bring up something new, you send a topic. And then the whole sort of user experience is built around making it really easy to review sort of all of the different conversations that have happened while you were away from your computer, sort of efficiently in this sort of one thread at a time sort of organized fashion. And in the sense that making it like, much more efficient to catch up on a lot of traffic, but it also sort of changes the way that an organization can collaborate because you can sort of expect people to read stuff that's important to them. You can, just because like they'll be able to actually see what are the 7 conversations that happen. And you're also just much more likely if you ask a question for somebody to reply because it's not just sort of like in between the 37 message thread about cats and the 27 message thread about, politics or whatever, right? Like it's, each one has sort of its own space. So that's sort of, I guess, the 3 sort of pieces of what Zulip is. It's a full-featured modern group chat tool. It's completely open source, and it has sort of a different model that our users find make them a lot more efficient at getting things done in chat.
And how did it first get started?
Yeah, so the backstory is sort of interesting. So the origin of Zulip actually comes out of this system at MIT called Zephyr, which was originally built as a printer notification protocol in the late 80s. So the protocol is terrible, but the sort of it had this sort of same topics feature, just sort of a detail of how the protocol worked. Like the channel would be like printer, and the topic would be what the name of the printer is or something like that. And the sort of over time at MIT, this system was sort of the dominant way that people did chat, and people built some very interesting clients around it. There was this really cool thing called Barn Owl that was a curses client that you'd run in a screen session. But it just had this fantastic user experience where you could, literally be sending and reading, hundreds or thousands of messages every day with your friends on the MIT campus. Maybe trying to get projects done, but also just, recreationally. You could sort of manage all that efficiently, in this tool. So we actually used it when starting Caseblaze as just because we found that it was a much better experience for getting stuff done. And that worked out okay for Caseblaze. Because, if you're like on the sales team at a company that's doing rebootless kernel updates, like it's totally cool to be using your curses client in a screen session. Like you sort of have to know enough about general Linux systemsy stuff in order to answer people's, questions about how does it interact with cron, or is it an agent, or whatever like funny questions people like to ask. And like, I guess like, we sort of integrated that system with how things work. So anytime anybody got an error trying to install a Caseblaze update anywhere in the world, we would get, if there's a new error, a chat notification, in our Zephyr setup. And you could just real-time debug in that thread. So, and that would be sort of one place. And then once we'd figured it out, we could then like mention the people on the sales team, and then they'd be able to email the, customer, basically let them know that we've already fixed the problem, probably before the customer even got around to emailing us. And it was just like that type of integration, where it was just an amazing experience for getting stuff done, and was just really flexible. We integrate all of our processes in this way. And when, we talked to a lot of our friends who were doing technology projects, and they were, pretty jealous of our setup, and we were sort of thinking just like for whatever we did next, we'd want to have a similar setup. But like, basically for any other product that we could be building, it probably wasn't going to be a great plan to have like our internal communication tool be a Curses client running in a screen session, it's just sort of ridiculous. So sort of that, our inspiration was like, maybe the next thing that we should build, basically the founders of the original Zulip company were the same as the Ksplice founders, was to build sort of a modern group chat tool that one could feel good about, that had this model. So that's sort of how Zulip got started, and we sort of built that product for the original Zulip company, I guess, for about a year and a half, and it was doing pretty well. Like there were thousands of users. They were excited about it, and then sort of we ended up getting this unexpected acquisition offer by Dropbox, and after some sort of thinking about what we wanted to do, I ended up joining Dropbox. So I spent about 2 years at Dropbox. And my role there actually ended up having nothing to do with Zulip. So I sort of did some stuff on there, stuff related to Zulip for a few months, but then I ended up running the 3 million line Python code base at Dropbox as sort of like the architect of their platform. And, a lot of interesting stories from that experience. And actually a lot of things that I learned about how to have a large number of engineers collaborate on a project. But anyway, I guess this is sort of digressed into sort of my story. But anyway, so I guess the story for Zulip there is that Zulip was acquired by Dropbox, and Dropbox didn't work on it at all. So that lasted for about a year and a half. And one of the sort of surprising things is that like basically none of the users stopped using Zulip, of our beta users. It's pretty rare. Like if a project gets acquired and like it's still running, but it's clear that nobody's working on it, like usually all the users go away and switch to something else, especially given how much press Slack was getting as like the coolest thing ever, at the time. And actually some of them did switch to Slack and then switched back because they decided that even though Zulip was unmaintained and the build labs didn't work, and because they just like randomly broken at some point during that year and a half, like they still preferred using Zulip to Slack. So it was sort of one of the pieces of data that suggested to me that we should try to make sure that people can keep using Zulip because people really appreciated it. And so I ended up, sort of working out this plan with Dropbox where they were okay with it being open source because they weren't going to do anything with it, but we needed to do work to open source it because I don't know if you any sort of code base that's, tens of thousands of lines of code, you had some customers, you probably put some customer names and some comments or some commit messages. You probably have like some, secret values that you put in the code, maybe a little sloppily, whatever. And you don't really want to like release, a thing like that, especially when the server is still running, in production. So we ended up like having a plan where 10 Zulip users came to Dropbox Hack Week for a week. And I sort of like coordinated the effort, and we got all the work done to make it possible to open source Zulip and have there be like an easy way to install it both in production and for a development environment to sort of modify it. That resulted in Zulip being open sourced about a year and a half ago. And that post was probably announcing that it was open sourced was probably the most popular thing I've ever written. I think like 200,000 people read that blog post saying that Zulip was open sourced. Basically, like, after that point, I sort of was maintaining the Zulip open source project, sort of nights and weekends, like 5 or 10 hours a week, because like Dropbox wasn't working on my main job at Dropbox. Was running our 3 million line Python code base. I ended up leaving Dropbox about a year ago, and I've sort of been focusing on Zulip as what I spend my time on since then. And it's been sort of amazing to see the project go from, basically just me and my spare time to, literally hundreds of people working on it. And I think I counted a few weeks ago, and there was about 30 people who are spending this summer working on Zulip, which is kind of incredible. Yeah, so I guess that's sort of like how Zulip got from where it began to today, sort of at a high level.
And just briefly, where does the name come from? There are a few possible guesses that people can make based on the sort of sound and word roots, but I'm curious where it actually originated.
Yeah, it's Tulip with a Z. The backstory for that is sort of, this is probably an experience that a lot of people who've worked on a startup will appreciate. Is you need to name your startup. The problem is that like all the really good names, like you really want to have the .com domain for the name of your startup, and all of the really good names are taken, or if you wanted to buy the .com domain, there's some like squatter who'll tell you that it'll cost $120,000 or whatever, and probably you could negotiate it down to 30 or something. But like it's really pretty challenging. And so we basically did a brainstorming process where we tried to think of sort of everything that had the properties we wanted to name, that it's easily spellable, easily pronounceable, sort of in both directions. Like if you pronounce it, somebody else will be able to spell it, and vice versa, and tested them on these criteria. And we used all sorts of algorithms for generating them, including taking words and replacing letters and all sorts of other fun stuff. And this was the best thing that we were able to get based on that process. 5-letter domain is pretty good. But I don't know. I think naming projects is one of the great challenges in the world, and I think it's only going to get harder as more and more good names are a duplicate with some other popular.
Yeah, exactly. The two hard problems in computer science: cache invalidation, naming things, and off by one errors.
Exactly. Yep.
And so you were saying that after the project got acquired by Dropbox, that for the most part, Dropbox wasn't doing any work on it. Was it being used internally at Dropbox at all? Or was it more of an acqui-hire where they wanted to purchase the Zulip company in order to bring you guys on board as engineers for their project? Or originally have plans to make use of the Zulip platform for their own purposes?
Yeah, so Dropbox actually did end up using one component of Zulip for some of their collaboration projects, sort of a piece of our server backend. But I think like their intent was, for us to build the sort of collaboration roadmap for Dropbox, whatever thing that they were going to do in that space, whether it was a thing like, Zulip or Slack or a thing, that's sort of totally different from that. What sort of ended up happening, is we sort of got to Dropbox, and our determination was that Dropbox's resources were just allocated towards the wrong things. Like the main Dropbox product had just a lot fewer people working on it than anybody would have guessed at the time. We had 250 engineers, and a lot of those were working on infrastructure and scaling and stuff like that. But the sort of team working on the core desktop client, the thing that you install on your machine that is what people think of as Dropbox, across Mac, Linux, and Windows, like that whole team was like 10 people. And at the same time, the team working on like the Dropbox website and Dropbox for Business and sort of like the stuff that sort of I thought of as really the ways that were sort of the simplest plan for Dropbox to be sort of commercially successful was also like a pretty small team of like 10-ish people. And there were just tons of sort of product initiatives working on new things, some of which have come out, like Carousel, there's a team working on Mailbox, things like Dropbox Paper. And we didn't really feel like what Dropbox needed was another team working on, like another sort of product. We thought that like they needed more sort of top people working on the main Dropbox product. And I think that was the right decision, because like 6 months after we joined Dropbox, like the Zulip founders were actually running the main Dropbox product, across like all platforms, mobile, web, desktop, and, that was a great experience for us. And I think really was quite valuable for Dropbox, far more so than I think, what could have been possible working on, sort of Zulip at Dropbox in terms of value for Dropbox. But it was also, I think a great experience for me to sort of, be working on sort of a code base that, was that huge that, I didn't have a lot of prior context on, and trying to make it more productive. One of the things that we sort of found is like, I was, appalled as to how hard it was to sort of get work done on Dropbox's main Python code base called the meta server. And we sort of ended up doing a huge amount of work to try and fix a lot of the systemic problems there, which resulted in, some popular open source projects that sort of came out of that, like the MyPy stack type system for Python. It's basically funded as part of that initiative. But one of the things that was sort of amazing for me is that, we met up with sort of my peers at places like, Airbnb or Twitter. Their situations were far worse than the Dropboxes. So actually, I think despite the fact that, sort of the developer experience at Dropbox, at least when I arrived, was far worse than anything I'd experienced before, and I think in part that's basically that I was spoiled by building my own tool chains. And, the reality is that basically all of these famous tech company unicorns are, sort of the internal tooling productivity situation is usually a kind of a disaster.
Yeah, having worked at a number of startups, it's definitely interesting how much of a front you can put on where you can make people believe that you have a much larger team than you actually do just because of the number of different solutions that you can just use as a SaaS offering to accelerate your capabilities and expand the productivity of your team beyond what would previously have been possible, 15, 20 years ago, but still, be sort of crushed under the load of technical debt and, not really be able to dig yourself out without some very concerted effort by the engineers on staff.
Yeah, I think it's a deeper problem than that. I think like my experience is that the sort of engineering managers at most companies, like, or product management, that there sort of ends up being a shift that happens when a company gets to be around 50-ish people, where sort of usually there's sort of some top-down allocation of where all the resources go that gets pretty forceful. And, if you're sort of a team of 3 people working on some stuff, like, you're probably going to, fix the problems that make it hard to get your work done, because it's just going to be frustrating and you just feel like I'm going to make my own time more efficient if I do it. But once you have a team of hundreds of people working on something, there's sort of this diffusion of responsibility thing where it's not like clear sort of who's supposed to do, what's probably like 10% of the total work, if not more. Maybe it's 30% of the total work of like making it efficient to be productive on a platform. And I think most product managers don't understand that, and many engineering managers don't understand that. And so it ends up being the case. All the resources get sort of tight deadlines for doing specific user-facing results, basically. And, the sort of spare time that individual engineers have is not sufficient, to sort of fix the systemic problems. And you start to get really buried under these, piling up little piles of technical debt that sort of nobody feels like they're in a position to deal with, just in terms of like they might even know how to fix it, but they don't have the sort of authorization to work on it, But I think that there's also a phase of, a lot of companies, sort of started out as a startup 10 years ago, and what things you were supposed to use 10 years ago are just totally different now. There's just like a ton of work to keep refactoring your sort of infrastructure to be reasonable in the current year and not reasonable 5 years ago when your choices were different.
And speaking of the sort of capabilities and design choices in your application, I'm wondering if you can dig a bit into how Zulip itself is implemented, and particularly the fact that it's a real-time chat system, and most of the time when people are thinking real-time, they're probably thinking Node.js or some other WebSocket communication capability, but my understanding is that the bulk of Zulip is actually implemented in Django. So wondering if you can describe the architecture and the design of the application that allows you to be able to use Django while still having that real-time communication capability layer.
Yeah, sure. So I think this is actually a common confusion, I think, that people have when they think about real-time communication. So there is like an element of real-time communication that's important in a chat app. You need to have an efficient server-to-client push system to notify the client, that there's a new message and maybe what its content is, so you don't need an extra round trip and so on. But that system only needs to do that thing. That's the only thing which is sort of real-time essential. Everything else is just, you need to do AJAX requests and, have them be responsive. And so we actually have a component for doing that server to client push, which is not done in Django. It's done in Tornado. But the whole thing is probably 2,000 lines of code, including tests. And, we haven't really had to modify since 2013 because it just has a well-defined interface. So there's basically like the sort of structure of the architecture is that Django, when it wants to send in a real-time push event to the client, does a request over to Tornado to let it know to do that. And, that's basically it. But there's a lot of subtle details in doing that right. And if anybody's interested, we actually have a quite detailed set of documentation on the Zulip Read the Docs that explains sort of the whole design around how our Tornado system works and how we avoid race conditions and so on. But it's probably not something I can effectively get into, in this interview. But I guess like sort of the high level architecture is, we have, sort of pretty standard web application setup. We've got a Django, thing using uWSGI, that tacks to, a Postgres database. And, we also use memcached for caching and Redis for some slightly more complicated caches. And we use RabbitMQ for enqueuing, events to be processed, later, either for actually some communication with the Tornado process, but primarily for just sort of deferring work, so that we can. So actually, one of the things that is important for sort of, a good real-time communication is you want to have like your request to send a message, that needs to be processed very quickly. So we do sort of have a model where the stuff that needs to happen immediately, happens immediately. That takes like tens of milliseconds, which is basically instantaneous. For server side, your performance is going to be dominated by network connectivity when you're at that sort of level. And then the sort of the rest of it, you should just write in whatever framework is going to make it most efficient to implement all the features that you need to have. And I would argue that for a real-time chat application, actually the sort of big challenge in 2017 is surface area. There's just literally hundreds of features that sort of people expect as sort of table stakes for just being a modern real-time group chat application. And on top of that, there's, hundreds more sort of additional improvements that one could make that, we would ideally like to have in Zulip and, have been building over the last several years.
Yeah, and in terms of the architecture that you've got as well, one thing that I was surprised and pleased by when I was going through the documentation is the fact that for your full text search, you're not immediately jumping straight to Elasticsearch, and you're actually leveraging the capabilities of Postgres for being able to do that full text indexing and do the searching so that you can reduce the number of external dependencies that you have to run to be able to deploy the server itself.
Yeah, using the Postgres full text search, I think, is one of the best decisions that we made architecturally because, it allows us to do a hugely expansive range of different types of filters, as to what you're searching for, because you just translate them into the appropriate, SQL thing with no issues with synchronicity. We don't have to worry about passing a feed of data over to something like Elasticsearch, to update, its index, every time that something changes. You just edit the rows in the database and you're done. And there's our performance is, if you sort of ask people who use search, I think our search performance is probably the best of, any of the real-time chat applications that I've seen. It's really fast. And it's just because, if you have the right database indexes, Postgres is fantastic. Actually, that sort of reminds me of a little bit of our story. So we actually, originally Zulip was built on top of MySQL, and we actually migrated from MySQL to Postgres, a year after starting the company, which is not a, pleasant migration. But we found that using MySQL, we were spending all this time both working around stupid MySQL defaults, it's Swedish case-insensitive default collation and, but also just sort of from a query planning perspective, we were doing all these performance optimizations, where we need to worry about the query plan and so on. And when we switched to Postgres, basically everything, that had been fast with MySQL got faster. And we could throw out all of the, sort of custom query plan fiddling stuff that we'd done and just use the Django RM for 98% of database queries that we need to make, and it just worked. So, I think Postgres is definitely also one of the technology choices that I feel really good about. I think it's saved us countless hours of wasted effort tuning MySQL that is just completely unnecessary with Postgres.
Yeah, it's definitely funny how quickly people will jump immediately to using Elasticsearch just because of the sort of cargo cult mentality where if everybody thinks if you want to have search, you have to have an external system to do that because you can't do it in your database for X reason without actually necessarily digging deep into the capabilities of the tools that they're already taking advantage of.
Yeah, I feel like that's a pattern that, I don't know, I guess one of the things I find really interesting is the microservice trend, where sort of the idea is that you should split your big service into 50 smaller things that all interact. And it's one of those things that is a good idea if you're at Google, because your problem if you're at Google is that you literally have many thousands of engineers working on things and you need to figure out how to create interfaces between this team of 30 engineers and this other team of 20 engineers that are just easier to manage organizationally. But, for the vast majority of projects, you just end up creating a bunch of overhead for yourself because in order to change something, you have to make a change in both of these services. And you would have been just as happy from a code perspective, just making it a library, or a Python module that has a well-defined interface for almost any goal that you would have, So anyway, that's sort of been interesting. I think that there are applications where microservices can be really important, but I feel like it's an idea that has far more reach in terms of people wanting to grab onto it and try to use it in their project than its actual utility. And I think, the Elasticsearch thing is a good example of that.
And what have been some of the most challenging aspects of building, maintaining, and growing the Zulip project?
Yeah, so I think, probably technically the biggest challenge is really just the issue of surface area. I sort of mentioned Zulip has a Python server. We've got the sort of web application on top of that. There's, sort of all the HTML documentation and landing, pages and login pages and stuff like that. We have literally dozens of built-in integrations that are included in the Zulip code base, et cetera. And all of those have documentation, including screenshots explaining like, here's how you go into the GitLab UI and like configure GitLab to send its notifications into Zulip, which is really like arguably part of their documentation, because it's really just like, how do you create an outgoing webhook, in GitLab? But, we sort of feel that, we should explain, you should only need to go to one place to learn how to like set your thing up. And so that's important to us. So anyway, like that's sort of been a challenge, which we've been struggling with, because, I think you don't want to end up with your project having a million lines of code, because it becomes unmaintainable. And, I feel pretty good about how we're doing on things like that integration issue. So if you want to write an integration, that's an incoming webhook integration in Zulip, like you literally have to write like 10 lines of formatting code. We have sort of a process that we document for how you can grab some test fixtures, or basically like the API, the format basically of those outgoing webhook messages that get sent out by, whatever the product is. And, there's sort of a markdown system where with mostly you sort of use macros where you can just write like, potentially like, 3 sentences of sort of custom content, in a screenshot or something for, if the product is simple to configure, and obviously more if it's more. And that's sort of all you need to do to write a new integration and have it have like 100% test coverage, where you can be very confident that it's going to work for all the different types of events that you need to do. And so I guess like sort of technically, like a lot of sort of our strategy has been how to take things that would become basically a bundle of infinite work that just keeps growing forever and has a lot of duplicated code in it and ends up being a big source of pain for the project, and trying to figure out how to make those things something where, there's just not that much work that needs to go into them. Adding a new integration is a thing that like basically any engineer can read our documentation and do in a few hours, at most, and produce the same result that another engineer would produce, that is correct, as opposed to having different types of spaghetti code. So I guess that's sort of, another sort of example of the surface area problem is that, with mobile, like building a separate app for Android and iOS is just incredibly painful, because even if you're just trying to make them exact copies in terms of the implementation, so that you don't have to make as many decisions product management wise, you still like, when you find a bug in one, you need to like investigate whether that bug's in the other. When you, have a new feature, in our Zulip's Markdown, which is we use Markdown for our message formatting. If we need to add it, we need to add it to both places. And that sort of creates a bunch of release management headaches where, sort of you don't want to like create new syntax that's going to make the app crash, and so you need to test on both iOS and Android to avoid that, and so on. So anyway, so moving to React Native has been huge on that front. But I feel like we're sort of always coming up with new techniques for how to sort of optimize how much of our time goes into actually improving Zulip versus into just the work around having a large project.
And are you currently working full-time on Zulip? Is that sort of your full-time engagement? And if so, how are you managing to support yourself, particularly given the fact that it's a fully open source project?
I've been, had the good fortune of, selling 2 startups to big companies, Ksplice to Oracle and Zulip to Dropbox. And also my wife is a data science manager and, makes a good salary. So I don't have like sort of a super immediate, desperate need to make a salary. But, I do think that it's, really important, sort of to make an open source project with sort of the scope and surface area of Zulip successful, that you have some sort of model for how you're going to be able to fund a core team that can work on that full time. You just want it to be the case that one can be confident that people will be responsive to important bug reports, et cetera, et cetera. And I think like for a project of our scale, that's necessary. And the other thing is that a common piece of feedback that we hear is that people want to use Zulip. They really like the sort of topic threading model that we have, but they don't want to run their own server. So, or they want to run their own server, but like, they don't really want to be like on the hook if they end up with some problem that they don't know how to debug and, be sort of counting on best effort support. So, I'm actually working on a sort of company with the sort of business model being to sort of solve those 2 joint problems. So, we'll offer a SaaS hosting service so that, if you want to use, Zulip, you can have sort of the same type of experience you would have using a commercial product like Slack, where you just go to a website and sign up and, you can pay some money to in exchange for being able to use it. And then also providing sort of commercial support services for the enterprises that are using Zulip. Because, if you're using, something like Zulip for your group chat solution, like at 1,000-person company, like that's a mission critical thing. It's about as important to people's daily productivity as your email server. And nobody would think of sort of not having a plan for what's going to happen if like their email server like runs into some issue. Usually people just outsource it, but you're going to want to have some sort of support contract. So that's sort of the long-term plan there for sort of how to make this work long-term.
Yeah, one of the things that I found interesting and appealing as I was setting up a test instance of Zulip while I was doing research for the show is the fact that when you are creating a new organization on the server, it specifically asks whether it's for a company or an organization or whether it's intended to be community oriented so that you can determine the sort of gatekeeping that goes into play as far as somebody signing up, whether they need to have an email that's of the same domain or if it's just anybody can self-register. So as opposed to the Slack approach, where if you wanted to be able to build a community discussion with Slack, then you have to use some sort of trampolining service where you have a website that will send you an invite after you enter your email, where it's a bit of a workaround as opposed to having it built into the core of the platform.
Yeah. And of course, we sort of offer those as sort of settings that are somewhat independent of that corporate versus, community question. But yeah, the main point of there is to be able to set like good defaults based on what sort of organization. And then also sort of from a policy perspective, there's features that are really important for sort of corporate environments, like the ability for an IT administrator to read all of your messages, including your private messages, that you might not want to have in a community organization. Like a community organization, very well might want it to be the case that like, people have some amount of privacy, in their communications in that community. And so that sort of, is primarily just about trying to set the right defaults and the right expectations, basically, for how that community is going to work. So you don't end up with surprises where somebody thought that their communications were private, but actually, like, the dude who set up the server, has access to everything that you've been saying.
And one of the things that you've touched on a few times is the fact that there is a very large and healthy community contributing to and using Zulip. So I'm wondering, what are some of the methods that you and some of the other people in the project have used to foster and grow that engagement?
Yeah, so, I think this is a really important topic, and there's probably like 10 topics in this space that I could sort of talk about for like an hour. So, but sort of at a high level, I think, if you're building an open source project and you want it to be like a real healthy, open source community, you really need to optimize the project for the ease of contribution. So, how efficiently does the project convert like a person who, is technically skilled and is interested in contributing to somebody who has successfully contributed? And, most open source projects do a really bad job of this. So I actually been involved in organizing like the San Francisco Python community sprints where, we have like 50 people get together and work on various open source projects. And, it was amazing how, some of the projects, they were halfway through the day, of a first day of a 2-day sprint. And like most of the people didn't have their dev environment working. And so they hadn't like even attempted to start, coding something. And I think this is just, part of the reason that I organize these sprints is that, it's can come as a shock to the people who run that open source project to see that happen, where they're even there to help out and the people are still floundering halfway through the day, because it really like can help focus your attention on sort of why it is that your project hasn't been attracting contributors. Obviously there's a lot of things that go into a project to attract contributors. You have to have people who like are interested in modifying the software, whether they be users or people who are just excited about the technology or something. Those people have to have some amount of programming skills, unless you're going to be teaching them programming. But, there's just a ton of elements that go into it. So for Zulip, like we've really optimized, like, how long does it take to set up a development environment? I don't know if you went through our instructions for that, but, we actually worked with a technical writer to make, those instructions as good as possible. It cost a little bit of money, but, I think it's one of the most important things that you can do as an open source project to improve your project is making it the case that like getting set up as a developer is really fast. It's also the case, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, if you're working on a, code base, you're going to add in new dependencies or add data mice migrations or other things where like sort of the environment needs to be reprovisioned as you update it. The environment. And we have a script that will do that reprovisioning. And we've optimized that script so that you can do a not provision, if nothing has actually changed in 3 seconds. So the time being spent is only the time that it takes to actually install new dependencies if the dependency list actually changed. There's a whole bunch of sort of caching and so on infrastructure that underlies this. We sort of, put a lot of effort in writing our code on readability. So if you sort of browse around the code of Zulip, you'll find that like we're very careful about how we name basically every variable in our code base. Very careful about how we name every function, and very careful about avoiding like, sort of confusing duplicated things. Like if there's two things that are very similar, they'll have a comment on top of both explaining like why we needed two of them rather than like one function that had a argument or whatever. And I think like that sort of can help make it accessible to people. And there's stuff about documentation. We have invested a ton into tooling. Actually, I think tooling is probably one of the things that is worth talking about. So most projects, use some sort of linter, to sort of make sure that, people are using like a reasonably consistent style in terms of, parentheses and, or white space or whatever. But we've actually like built sort of a whole sort of mini linter framework where we'll run like the 8 different linters that we use in parallel. And you might ask like, why are there 8? Well, you've got like a, linter for our HTML for how the white space formatting works. We've got a, ESLint for our JavaScript. We've got, the PEP8 linter for our Python code. We've got a Puppet parser linter to validate the syntax of our Puppet configuration, which is what we used for managing configuration and upgrading it and so on. And then we've also got like, a few sort of custom linters that are things like a little framework where we can have like 100 regular expressions that we check that there's nothing that matches those. So like a common problem that you'll have in basically any project with new contributors is like they won't know that they need to tag strings for translation. And, that's like a, just a thing that like most people aren't taught about in school. It's really important, if you want to have a project like Zulip that's been translated into like a dozen languages, you want to make sure that when you add a new string, that's user facing, that it is tagged for translation. But it's just sort of like a huge pain to just with each new contributor, have to teach them that you need to tag your strings for translation and review. So we've just built a set of linters that will basically check, if it's a string in a context that'll be user facing, like, it'll give them a little error and tell them they need to tag it for translation. And anyway, we've got like 100 of those that we built up over the last year. And that's actually like a huge part of what I spent my time doing when I only had 5 or 10 hours a week to work on Zulip nights and weekends, was building out this tooling. Basically anything that I was telling people in code review that like, it was like clear that you could build a little tool that would like tell them to do that so that they would find that out without having to, sort of spend both of my time and their time doing sort of review round trips on it. Like we've sort of automated. And I think that's been really important to making the case that like, some people will get started working on Zulip and, get their first contribution in within like a few hours of when they start like downloading the code base, even to like including like debugging, whatever bug it is. But, I think that so anyway, those are sort of like some of the technical elements. I also think that having a good community setup is really important. So we use Zulip, obviously in the Zulip project, and, you can visit our chat.zulip.org community, and there's, usually 50, something like that, people online, depending on the time of day. And it's really great because you can just ask a question and, in development health, and people will help you debug. And that debugging session is sort of, it's your own space because you've got your own topic and thread for that. And so that can go back and forth potentially for a month, if you're working on a complicated feature. And, it just is a very sort of convenient experience for both the sort of contributor who has a place where they can send things and other people will reply and they don't need to like worry about interfering with other people's stuff or whatever, or other people talking about things and trampling over their thing like you do have in IRC. And then from a maintainer perspective, it's really convenient because just, I wake up in the morning and there's a bunch of unread messages on different threads, and I can just sort of reply to each of them, and everybody's getting sort of generally quick, responsive, personal attention from experts on the project. And one thing that I probably should highlight on the community front is that I think responsiveness is really important. A lot of people are really intimidated about getting involved in contributing with open source. They like have it, they really care about open source. They have a desire to get involved and contribute, but they spend their first day of their first contribution worrying about whether they've worded everything properly, and just worrying about whether somebody's going to yell at them and so on, just because it's it's really scary to be sort of putting your work out there and not knowing what's going to happen. But then like a pretty common thing that happens after they get over all those barriers is just like nobody responds for a week. And, my view is that if people get, a nice friendly response, like, well, it depends on time of day, but like, ideally, an hour later, maybe, 6 hours later, like it just feels like a completely different experience as a new contributor. And I think that's really helped us retain, so many talented people working on Zulip.
Yeah, having the guardrails available for when you first get started with a project, knowing that if you make a breaking change, you're automatically going to know about it, and you don't, sit there and wonder and worry about whether or not you're introducing a new bug to the system that might be a regression from somebody else's work that they've already done, so that you can feel free to start playing around and seeing what changes will have what kinds of effects. And then another thing that I noticed in your repository is the labels that you have for the issues, for where you're curating issues for new contributors so that you have them available for somebody to get started with without having to have the entire context of the project to be able to actually make a meaningful change.
Yeah. Actually, the issue tracker is probably one of the more important things of my strategy on the front of making Zulip friendly to contributors. So you notice the thing about sort of bite-sized we tag in issues that are sort of bite-sized and accessible. A few other things that we do that I highly recommend. One is that we have this, GitHub workflow bot, which we call Zulip bot, that basically works around a bunch of the sort of permissions and notifications issues that GitHub has. So like, as an example, like in GitHub, you can't give somebody the ability to assign an issue to themselves unless you also give them full write access to the repository. So basically, like, you can't just give some new contributor who just showed up on your project full write access to your repository, because that just feels a little bit crazy. And so effectively, like, there's no way for a new contributor to show up and claim an issue. So anyway, our bot, you just post a comment that says @ZulipBotClaim on the issue, and it'll basically add you as a read-only collaborator to the repository. And then it turns out you can assign issues to read-only collaborators, even though they can't assign them to themselves. And anyway, there's a bunch of sort of things like that we do with Zulip. It's actually like a totally configurable framework. So if anybody's interested, you can check it out and use it in your project. But basically trying to sort of cut down these barriers to feeling like you can be the maintainer for a subsystem. Another sort of example of that is we have a system of labels for the different areas of the project. So if you're sort of feeling overwhelmed by everything going on in Zulip, you can look at what are look at the markdown issues. So maybe you pick one bite-sized issue, and then you can sort of continue and just work through all of the issues in our markdown project as you sort of gain experience in that subsystem, and eventually become the maintainer of that. And each of these sort of areas we try to keep under like 30 open issues or something like that, and we'll split it if it gets too big. And that's been a huge help in sort of getting people into these roles of sort of subsystem maintainers, is just having a way for them to subscribe. So one of the things we do with Zulipbot is whenever an issue is labeled with one of those labels, it'll send a notification mentioning a team. Anyway, it's basically a hack, but basically it's possible to subscribe to an area label within Zulip on GitHub, which is just not possible with GitHub in general. But the final thing I wanted to talk about with issues is a lot of projects the things that they put in their issue tracker will be like, a one-sentence description of a bug, or, maybe like, a screenshot showing a bad behavior or something like that. And that'll be sort of the issue that a new contributor encounters when they're looking at whether they want to work on it. And like, I don't know, if you look at like a screenshot showing some bad behavior, like you have no idea like what's going to be involved in doing that. And so you're going to like look at that issue and be like, I don't know how to do that, and bounce through like 75 issues, before you find something that you feel like, I can get started on this. I can work on this. So a big part of like what I do is whenever a new issue is opened, I'll post a, paragraph long comment on it that explains like, okay, like here's, the section of the code that this is involved. Like I'll often do a pointer to one of our documentation articles. We have like 100,000 words of developer documentation, which, I think is really valuable. And I'll talk a little bit about how we sort of put that together later. But basically put together sort of the data that you would want as if you had a new hire at your company and you wanted to give them as their first day project, like what is the stuff you need to tell them to get started? Like, okay, here's the doc that explains how the system works. Here's like the file that this issue is probably in. And here's like some high level thoughts about like roughly how I think we should fix this. Cause a lot of things, there's like different ways you could change the behavior and it's like not really clear. But the overall goal of that is to make it the case that like somebody can, I'm looking at an issue. If you're like a reasonably skilled programmer in the languages and stuff involved, like you could work on this issue. Like it's not just sort of a thing that's impossible. So we have like one of our pieces of documentation is a new application feature tutorial that like explains how to add a new setting checkbox in Zulip, and, sort of goes through the whole flow of how our real-time sync process works and all of that, so that like it both sort of teaches you how that works, but it's also like whenever there's a new setting, I'll just link to that document. Then, they only need to know how to implement the behavior that setting is supposed to control. And the rest of it is sort of, you just read the doc and you can figure it out.
And what have been some of the most unexpected aspects of working on Zulip, whether it's from a technical perspective of things that you've learned, or from engagement with the community and just learning things from the people that you're working with?
Sure. I guess one unexpected technical thing is just how complex a correct implementation of emoji, for in a group chat application is. There's just just an amazing number of different details. You have both, the emoji that you put in messages and emoji reactions, and you want those to share a sprite sheet. So you need to figure out how to do the like scaling, correctly. And we ended up with some scrolling performance issues because we used the wrong CSS for scaling. So we needed to fix that. And then, there's sort of the, like, how do you name the objects? Because, emoji are sort of nice. They all have sort of a Unicode series of code points that defines like what emoji character that is. But, we actually support, uploading custom emoji. So then like, where do you put like the ID for that custom emoji and that sort of code point structure? And, it's just, there's just an amazing amount of complexity that is sort of hidden behind this. And that doesn't even get into the issues of like, how do you type ahead ahead for sort of which emoji that you're trying to select, when like you might be searching for the thumbs up emoji, but maybe you think it's called +1, or maybe you think it's called thumbs up. And like, how do you sort of avoid having duplicate copies of it in your emoji picker? Because that's sort of silly and looks bad while still sort of supporting people using either of those two names. And anyway, it's just, it's been sort of fascinating, like just how much total, sort of code, ends up going into that, in every single project. Sort of on the community side, I think one thing I've been surprised by is you see a lot of sort of bad behavior in some open source projects. I think both, the Linux kernel community and the Debian community have had issues at various times in the past with being unwelcoming to new people. Some people being a little bit of bullies or whatever, and it's sort of, I guess I'm sort of surprised that we've made it to 300 contributors, and there's basically, we have a code of conduct, but I think we haven't had a single code of conduct invocation about some particular thing that somebody was doing in a year and a half, with hundreds of people. And I don't really have a good explanation for that. I mean, I think part of it is that I think we just produce such a sort of friendly and welcoming vibe in terms of how people communicate on Zulip that maybe we haven't attracted troublemakers yet. But I don't know. That's sort of been interesting for me because it is a thing that I've definitely seen in communities I've been part of. I've been involved in both the Linux kernel and Debian, but I'm just very glad that it we haven't had to deal with that ourselves yet, I guess.
And what are some of the things that you've got planned for the future of Zulip as you continue to develop and grow the community?
Sure.
The technical base as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said at the beginning that Zulip is the leading open source modern group chat tool, and we really want to delete open source from that story. I think, my experience is that people who've used both Zulip and something like Slack, they don't want to go back to using Slack after they've experienced the sort of efficiency that you get from having topics in your chat. It's sort of like the, experience that people my age at least remember when you first got to use, a threaded email client like Gmail after having tried the other webmail stuff, right? It just feels totally different. And, I think that there's, a long way to go on that front in terms of marketing and also just in terms of, just the total engineering required to have, that many millions of people using your thing. I'm sure that there'll be many more, sort of issues that are currently just, haven't been important because we don't have, as many people and funny use cases using Zulip. But, as your user base grows, you get more and more requirements. But I think that's one part of our vision. I think the other thing that's important to me is really helping support the idea that, if you're building an awesome new technology in 2017, you should be building it as open source software because that's sort of the right thing to do. So, I think, part of my sort of vision is that if Zulip is successful in becoming the leading group chat solution worldwide, like, I think that or I hope that would help, inspire people to sort of, if even sort of, a unicorn with $500 million, can be beaten by the power of a great open source community, I think that would have an impact on people's perspective on things. So I guess that's sort of part of my sort of personal goal. In terms of sort of the company, I think it's important to build sort of a self-sustaining, profitable company that gives us the sort of flexibility to maintain Zulip as completely open source software. I've talked to a lot of companies that are sort of built around an open source projects that have taken VC funding. And I generally, it seems like they have a very hard time, in practice, trying to actually really stay focused on their open source project. Often it'll become basically impossible to contribute as somebody who's not part of that company, sort of like how a lot of Google's open source projects work. So I don't know, I guess those are some thoughts on where we're hoping to go.
All right. Are there any other topics or questions that you think we should cover before we start to close out the show?
Oh, I guess we can come back to the sort of documentation thing we mentioned earlier. So Zulip has like 100,000 words of developer documentation. And, we had basically none when Zulip was open sourced 18 months ago. So this has mostly been written in that time period. And I guess sort of like my philosophy on this is, whenever somebody wants to work on some subsystem that is complicated enough that it needs to be documented, but like not like, isn't, I guess, like, the sort of correct answer as the expert is not to, sort of spend an hour with that person, like explaining it to them. Like the correct answer is to spend an hour writing some documentation on that and then send it to them. And I think like with that strategy, as sort of the primary strategy, you achieve sort of two goals. One is that eventually you end up with pretty good documentation on all the things that people are working on in your project, which is sort of what's important. But the second thing, which is a little bit more subtle, but it's important for an open source project, is that you don't end up wasting time as a maintainer. So like one of the things that, you find if you don't do that is you have some excited new person shows up who wants to build feature X. You spend several hours of your time teaching them enough about, how the rest of the system works so that they can build feature X. But then they end up actually too busy or not skilled enough or not interested enough or whatever to actually build the feature. So you sort of wasted 3 hours teaching this person who didn't end up, actually doing the thing that they sort of were intending to do. But if you instead, document it or explain, sort of your ideas on the issue tracker or something like that, that's fine. If that person ends up not having time for it, maybe somebody else will come by later and they can benefit from the work that you did. So anyway, I guess that's sort of another tip that I think should be very helpful to a lot of people. I actually use that also at K-Splice when, as sort of part of the preparation for my departing, I'd sort of been running the technology. And, I really didn't want it to be the case that, people weren't able to sort of go on with full understanding of how the system works. So, I just spent 3 months where whenever anybody asked me a question, I only responded in the form of documentation, not in the form of answering their question. And that's worked out pretty well too.
Yeah, I listened to an interview a little while ago with someone who was saying something along those same lines, where anytime somebody emailed them with a question, they would never just respond via email to the question. What they would do instead is write a blog post of the answer and then send an email with a link to that post so that other people would then be able to take advantage of that same knowledge without them having to duplicate the effort or go hunting back through their email to find where they had answered it before.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a key part of my process, I guess, is that you ask the person to do sort of basically to suggest edits to the documentation after reading it. And I think that's really important too, because, I don't know, I guess my viewpoint is that anything that you produce that has not sort of been verified in some way is probably really bad. And so, it's just really great to take advantage of the fact that you have a person who actually needs that documentation to get something done. To get like a review that isn't just a cursory reading, but is they're actually trying to understand the system and they want to know the answer. And, that principle is sort of the same principle as to why I think it's really important if you're an open source project to do sprints, or if you're a company to have the people who work on the developer tooling actually watch new people try to get involved with the project, sitting over their shoulder is that's the way that you test the experience of getting started working on your technology, is you have to actually observe somebody doing it.
So unless you've got anything else to add, then I'll start to move us to the end of the show.
Sure.
So for anybody who wants to get in touch with you or follow what you're up to, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes and a link to the meta discussion site for anybody who has questions about getting involved with the project. And so I'll move us to the picks. And my pick this week is the Lego Mindstorm's EV3 robotics kit. I recently picked it up for my son so that we could start playing around with that and learning some robotics and teaching him some programming. And so far it's been very fun and entertaining, and there's a lot of really interesting things that you can do with it. And the logic brick itself is actually hackable so that you can load in an alternate firmware to be able to run Python on it. And there's actually somebody who created a interface extension board for a Raspberry Pi, so you can actually just hook a Raspberry Pi into the Lego components themselves and power all the servos and sensors that way. So it's definitely a pretty interesting set of materials and capabilities that you can build off of that. So with that, I'll pass it to you. Do you have any picks for us this week, Tim?
Sure, yeah, I have a couple. So one is a book, which is the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. It's, I guess, sort of my perspective on, I think if you're trying to build a really high quality process, I feel like your sort of first thing that you attempt should be to automate things. Make it the case that it's not possible for a human to screw up by forgetting to do something or doing something wrong or whatever. But, wherever that's not possible, or if you have a thing where it's very difficult to do, the next best thing is a checklist. And, throughout my career, I've found that, if you really want to make something high quality and there's any sort of human series of steps that needs to happen there, you should use a checklist. And it's just a great book that sort of, it's very short and sort of teaches you both, how to be awesome at checklists and maybe help you explain sort of how valuable they are across a sort of wide spectrum of industry from, medicine to construction to everything else. And, the second is, about cooking. So, my wife and I cook at home a lot, and, one of the things that, you find, if you cook a lot is that, often you'll have some recipes that you find that are pretty great, but you end up modifying them based on your preferences when you actually make them. And it was really good, but you want to be able to make it again later. And often people end up with like, this problem that, you found recipes on 20 different sites or in books or whatever. And our solution to that is that we have a, wiki basically just for my wife and I to keep track of our recipes. It's at recipes.timandalya.com. And, we just find that it's fantastic because, we can keep track of exactly, what it was that we did so that results are reproducible, and, which is just super valuable for debugging and producing, sort of what you want. And it's also super easy to share. And, it's like very little effort. Usually we'll start out, with something, we'll just put the link to the source recipe, and then, you start adding notes on what you modified and how well it worked out and so on. And I don't know, I think it's, if you're into cooking, it's a pretty good technique that, can make your life better. So.
All right. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting approach. So great. Well, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share the story of Zulip and the technology behind it and how you're growing the community. It's definitely an interesting project. And I've actually installed my own instance of it. So for anybody who wants to check that out, I'll leave a link to that in the show notes so that you can join the Podcast and It chat community there. And I appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, cool. Thanks so much. And also, if for anybody interested in checking out Zulip, you can just stop by our community at chat.zulip.org and sort of see it in action with our large active community there, which maybe your community will be soon. But for now, it's just a really nice way to sort of see the whole thing in action.